following is a conversation with Sophie Parker-Thompson, Master of Wine. Since 2013, Sophie and her husband Matt have been making small batch wines from single vineyard sites across New Zealand, including Marlborough, Central Otago, and Oaks Bay, under the label Black Canvas. Sophie is known not only for her work as a producer and consultant, but also for her role in advocating for the diversity of Marlborough as chair of Appellation Marlborough Wine. In this episode, we discuss her Master of Wine paper published in 2021 titled "What is the relationship between the use of sulfur dioxide and biogenic amine levels in wine," which addresses the controversial topic of SO2 and headaches. A quick suggestion, prepare the popcorn for that one. We also talked about Chardonnay Marlborough and its characteristic traits before finishing with a discussion of her work at Appellation Marlborough Wine. Sophie's analysis is not that of a classic sedentary producer from a well-known region, but rather of someone who has traveled and worked extensively. Her insight into the future of the region comes from a deep global understanding of the wine world, and we felt it was important to discuss New Zealand in these terms. This is One Bottle, 3 Questions. Thank you for listening. Sophie, thank you very much for being with us. I've really tried to go through your MW paper. Is an insane one. I was thinking that it would be great if we can try to explain it to somebody that is not really well skilled in chemistry or doesn't know about intolerances. How would you describe your paper, and why did you write a paper such as this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, firstly, thanks for having me on the show, guys. It's always good to chat wine. And yeah, I guess the inspiration for my paper topic for the Master of Wine actually was born out of the fact that I wanted to do something that genuinely benefited the industry. One of the things that's always, I guess, plagued me as a wine producer and my husband Matt as well, you are always asked in the trade frequently about curly topics such as SO2 and sulfur dioxide and wine intolerance as well. And I got thinking about, well, there's there was a lot of negativity, and there still is a lot of negativity towards SO2 and its use. And I guess once you do some reading into wine intolerance, you actually can see that wine intolerance is such a vast and broad subject. I mean, there's over 600 different compounds in wine. It's one of the most complex products on earth, and of course, within that, people as individuals are very complex as well in what they react to. So there's a whole host of things that potentially could be causing wine intolerance. But one thing that I kept coming back to was that SO2, it's quite rare to be allergic to SO2. And the people who are allergic or have a reaction to SO2 definitely know about it, because they're often acute asthmatics. They have to carry around an inhaler the whole time, and they have to avoid all foods that have SO2. And we're all wine professionals, so we know that wine relatively has quite modest levels of SO2 in its finished product, far less than your average container of orange juice or French fries or mustard or dried apricots. So those kind of things would set those people who are sensitive to SO2, into kind of anaphylactic shock and be quite dangerous. For non-acute asthmatics and people, it's very rare to have a reaction, and SO2 is always generally a respiratory reaction too. You're not going to get, you don't get the things like headaches from SO2. That the clinical evidence just doesn't show that exists. So I thought, thinking, well, if it's not SO2, then what is it? And I kept coming back to this group of compounds called biogenic amines. And biogenic amines are quite a complex group of things too, and they can cause wine intolerance like symptoms. So they don't actually cause a allergic reaction. They cause what we call like a pseudo allergic reaction. So it's an allergic like reaction, and they're very relevant because today trends in winemaking today mean that you can actually end up with higher biogenic amine levels and higher concentrations of biogenic amines can lead to a greater chance of what we call BA toxicity. So I guess the really interesting thing for me was that there'd been quite little studied about BAs in general, and especially in a wine situation. So I'm not from a science background, so I found this topic really interesting because, to understand it simply, biogenic amines go from an amino acid into a biogenic amine, and the thing that causes that is bacteria. But bacteria have to have a special ability to convert that amino acid into a biogenic amine. So amino acids are in lots of different things, and the bacteria will then convert it into a biogenic amine, but they need to have conditions around them that promote that. So things like pH, SO2, ethanol, and temperature all impact that ability of biogenic amines to be produced by the bacteria. So yeah, it's quite a meaty topic to unpack, but
In layman's term, if is a bacterial, let's say, infection at that point, that means that most of those so-called natural wines that maybe are made with wild yeast fermentation, where maybe in certain years the fermentation are stopping, so all other things are happening, so maybe malolactic arrives before the end of the alcoholic fermentation, there will be a higher amount of BAs in the wine, so it will be technically somebody who drinks it will be more affected to have like headaches by drinking it. Am I correct?
Um, yeah, so if you're someone who is sensitive to biogenic amines, and when I talk about biogenic amines, I mean things like histamine. There's also some other interesting names like putrescine and tyramine and spermidine. They're all different types of biogenic amines, and the most toxic are histamine and tyramine, and they ordinarily regulate our bodily functions. So things like our normal immune regulation and things like circadian rhythm, all sorts of things. But what happens is if you ingest a product that has high biogenic amines, you can tip your body into a toxicity situation where it will trigger those allergic reactions. What we have in all of us is an enzyme which exists in our gut, and it's called diamine oxidase, and that breaks down the biogenic amines. And so, if the fascinating thing about wine and also beer, because biogenic amines is also in beer, so anything that has a bacterially influenced aspect to it, so cheeses, soy and tofu and things like that. But with alcoholic beverages, ethanol actually stops that enzyme from working properly in our gut. So your ability to detoxify the biogenic amines is significantly impaired. And so that's why if you're having a high BA wine and you've got alcohol in that wine as well, obviously then you're and you're already sensitive to BAs, then it doesn't take much to tip you into that toxicity state, and that's when you start to get things like the suite of symptoms like it could be anything from headaches to a running nose, to hives and rashes or upset stomach. All those things are symptoms of biogenic amine toxicity. And so that's that basis. What was interesting is that there are many variables that can impact what level of BAs ends up in the final wine. But what my research focused on, which hadn't been focused on much beforehand, if at all, was the impact and effect of what SO2 had on the biogenic amine accumulation in wine. And to cut this long story short, what my research found out is that the timing and use of SO2 is really critical to what level of BAs you end up with. So it found out that if there was zero SO2 added or only late SO2, so like just before bottling, it meant that these BA producing bacteria could remain totally unchecked, and they would convert any amino acids into biogenic amines. And so you'd those wines that had zero or no or any late added SO2 had astronomically high levels of biogenic amines, whereas wines that had early added SO2, I'm talking at the very start of fermentation, they had the lowest levels. So it really is, yeah, quite an interesting and paradoxical kind of finding, because people think that that SO2 is what triggers wine intolerance, and for us, as I mentioned, for a small amount of people who already know that they are sensitive to SO2, yes, they'll need to avoid wines with SO2, but and I'm very confident that in most instances, if you're getting these kind of allergic type reactions, BAs could very well be the culprit. But that's not to say there not necessarily other things. Some people are allergic to oak lactone. Some people are allergic to the other additives, egg, and other fining agents that may be present in the wine. So that is it in a nutshell. So it really, yeah, I think in the trends of winemaking today, where SO2 has been demonized to a large extent, I think that was valid for a while, because there was a period where there was seriously unregulated use of SO2, and talking in the kind of the 80s, where it was kind of shoveled into salad bars and just without any care or consideration, and people did have serious issues, because there was obviously SO2 at very high levels will always trigger a respiratory effect. But I think that the using SO2 as a tool actually is very important to ensure that you don't have this rampant microbiological growth, which can produce byproducts that are also very can be very harmful to, especially to some people who are sensitive.
I think it's a fascinating topic, and I think it sort of ties in with the sort of idea that a lot of wine education or pseudo wine education is done by marketing, and you could say never let the truth get in the way of a good story, and that's how various wines have been sold on fairly dubious claims, but there's so much smoke and mirrors in wine that people are quite happy to go along with it and sort of and push these narratives without really knowing. And actually the truth, in some sense, it's not as sexy or interesting, but is nevertheless is true and relevant, and in this case would actually help people who are trying not to get some kind of adverse reaction from the wine. But do you think in that sense that there is any? This is not a comment on whether the use of SO2 makes better wine, or those are the things, or just to say that you can't make a good wine without SO2. It's just the reality of what happens with regards to histamines and so on.
Yeah, look, when I'm talking about the levels of SO2 that you need to stop the microbial action of those bacteria that produce BAs, I'm talking really small amounts. Like I'm talking 30 milligrams per litre of SO2 at juice stage, which is the equivalent of, say, 15 parts per million. Sorry, 15 parts per million free. That's enough to actually stop it, because the bacteria that are the most pernicious kind of BA producers, are actually lactic acid bacteria. There's two strains, Pediococcus parvulus and Lactobacillus bulgari, and they are very sensitive to even bound SO2. So this is why, if you add it at the very beginning of before fermentation starts, that presence is enough to actually stop their action, because they have a bound SO2 as a bacteriostatic effect on them. So it's not stifling your creative ability. You can still do your skin contact and your spontaneous malolactic fermentation. You can do all the methods and things that you'd like to do. It's just you're just adding a very small amount of SO2 to ensure that the wine expresses, I think, a purer sense of place, because those I think it's also it's a telling thing, I think, because I always know, you probably found the same, Mike, that in Master of Wine exams, you knew you had natural wine in front of you if they, because of how it presented, but because they would never ask you what variety it was or where it was from, And I always think that's quite paradoxical, because often, and I've got, look, I understand why the natural wine movement came about, and I totally am on side with that. It was against the the industrialization and homogeneity of some of those soulless wines that I desperately can't stand. And so I think that was a good thing about the natural wine movement, is it forced people to kind of go back to basics. I just think when philosophy trumps logic of, okay, the natural wine movement is supposed to be about expressing terroir, but if you're not using tools to ensure that you get that purity and sense of place, all you're getting is microbiology that could be from anywhere, that actually obscures sense of place. I think that's just a bit misguided.
And Sophie, did this research change the way you use SO2?
Not at all. Not really, Nelson, to be honest. We were already adding SO2 at the beginning of fermentation for all the wines, purely for that reason, because Matt in particular, obviously very sensitive to bacterial taints, and so I think what we'd rather have that sort of approach where if you add a little bit at the start of fermentation, you don't need to add anything until right after malo, and I'm talking like many months after malo is finished, because we again don't want diacetyl notes or anything in the wine. So the wines don't actually get any SO2 until if they need one more adjustment, it would be just before bottling, but just always keeping the barrels well topped and no ullages. So militant on that to make sure that you don't get that SO2 kind of chew through, and that means that as I talked about, you have those really tight free to total ratios at the end, but you use enough SO2 so you don't get aldehyde, and you've got that fruit purity, but it's it fits where it's from.
Another question that's, I think, is very relevant for this conversation, because we are tasting today Tano Chardonnay, so from Blank Canvas, the 2023, and it's a good opportunity to talk about the style of New Zealand Chardonnay. That in itself, I'd just like to point out to any wine students or wine lovers listening to that, is a bit of a ridiculous question, because what happens if I said, we had an interview with La Chablisienne, so I didn't ask them, tell me about the style of Chardonnay in Burgundy, because it'd just be a ridiculous question, wouldn't it? And New Zealand has a lot more. It's a much longer country, so it's much further from north to south. Nevertheless, I think it's also practically relevant that people around the world probably do think about what is the style of New Zealand Chardonnay, or at least what is the end point and what is the starting point. So maybe if you just talk about how you came to this style and how that fits into where you are in Marlborough, I think that might be a good place to get into this discussion on Chardonnay.
Yeah, sure, Mike. Yeah, thanks. I think New Zealand Chardonnay is in a really, really exciting phase right now. As you've rightly pointed out, there's a full breadth of styles depending on producer, but also region. And I think the Chardonnays in general have grown up quite a lot in New Zealand. We've got better clonal material. People have figured out the right places to be planting the various clones in various parts of New Zealand. And I think for this style that you have in your glass right now, our Blank Canvas Tano, it's a new wine for us. We're really, really excited about it. It's very different to our other Chardonnay that we produce, we've been producing since 2018, our Reed vineyard, which has kind of developed quite a following internationally over that time. That's quite a richer style from a warmer part of Marlborough in the central Waido Valley. The Tano is from a really cool, wild, windswept part of Marlborough, a place called Blind River, which is south of the Awatere. And I think this is part of the discussion, Mike, is that New Zealand's only really just finding itself and discovering a more nuanced story. And I think a lot of that is happening in Marlborough, partly helped by what Appellation Marlborough wine is doing, which we'll get to perhaps later, but with the subregional mapping of the region, because one of the main things that heard time and time again is that Marlborough just produces one style of wine from, and it's all the same. And I hate hearing that, because it's a region of 30,000 hectares now, size of Champagne, and within that we've got so many different microclimates and soil types, and it's because of that reason that we can grow so many different varieties and produce so many different styles within just this one region. And so Blind River is a coastal part of Marlborough. We've got that really cold Pacific Sea and that Antarctic southerly coming up, and so it really is what I would genuinely describe as cool and dry. So very high wind run, it has high evapotranspiration, has sub 400 millimeters of rainfall, but that evapotranspiration also makes it almost quite desert and arid-like in a lot of ways. So the vines are quite, you see a real big difference in the vines from the White-O, which are kind of lush and vigorous, to the little spindly vines down in Blind River. And we've got Clone 95 down there, a little vineyard. It's only about 5 kilometers from the sea, 3 kilometers actually. And it produces, I guess the story how this came about was a friend of ours who's got the vineyard, and we worked with her for a long time as well. And Matt actually made Chardonnay from this block about 20 years ago probably, and he tried to make it in the reed style, because that was kind of like the new world style of what everyone was kind of making, with a bit of new oak and probably a bit of lee stirring back then as well. And it just didn't work. It just got too lean and austere, and kind of ditched it at that point in time. And it wasn't until actually, over the last 15 years, we've kind of been increasingly, thanks to Master of Wine, been drinking a lot of wines from all over the world. And one style that we've really honed in on and absolutely love, and we have a lot in our cellar, is Chablis. And just love that like solidy, nutty, musky character, along with that kind of zippy acidity and that lovely apple and hazelnut and grapefruit that you get. And we thought, oh my God, the site is just begging to be made in like it's a Chablis style, because you get that real intense kind of grapefruit zest, and it comes in at 12.5 grams per litre acidity naturally at 13% natural alcohol. And so we tried to, this is the first vintage, and so we thought, right, well, we'll get some larger format oak, and we're talking 2,500 litre beautiful oak couve that we got from Burgundy at vast eye-watering expense, about $45,000 New Zealand landed, and it arrived just before vintage in 2023, and we were so excited. It was like Christmas time. Unwrapped it and stuck our heads in, and it just smelled like hazelnuts. It's like, wow. Matt was like, this smells like Ravenel. And so we were like, great, this is gonna be excellent. So we didn't know how it was gonna turn out, but so this is hand-picked, whole bunch pressed, free run juice only, full solids fermentation, so no settling, straight into that big oak couve, and wild fermented, and it has spent 15 months on lees. Now we're wanting to have it to put it longer on oak, but longer on lees and oak, but for this 2023 vintage we just had the one couve. And so you'll be mortified to hear that Matt was like, right, we need another couve. And so the next year another one turns up. And then since then we've actually got another one. So now we've got 3. And he's threatening me that another one is turning up this next vintage, because we want to hold it in these beautiful expensive barrels for 18 months to give that longer time on lease. But I think you can see in this wine you do get that grapefruit, you get that real laser-like precision, and this has been through full malo as well. So it's got a really high natural acidity. So it's just begging to be made in this style. And I think one really important thing about Chablis is that I think in the New World, a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I'm going to make a Chablis style, and they just harvest it early, and you end up with a really lean, austere wine. So Chablis is not about that. It's about richness as much as anything. It needs to be ripe. So but you just need the right site, right? And so this site is perfect for that. And so, yeah, I think this is part of the evolution of New Zealand Chardonnay. So, yeah.
I mean, this taste is very much this is a grown-up style of wine, if that's not too much of a simplification. But and the thing that I personally like about it, and a question about winemaking and winemaking choices, is that when we've seen that needle shift into very skinny styles and then into very reductive styles, I found that quite problematic. And even in other grapes around the world, even being in Germany tasting Rieslings, and that they've moved into this like very reductive style. And I think it's because in the same way that in the 90s people stuck their nose in a glass and got this expensive new oak that was seen as the hallmark of a really good wine, and now when people stick their nose in the glass and get this kind of very reductive, overly reductive, in my opinion, often nose, then people think, oh, this must be a good wine. And you kind of stopped quite short of that. In a sense, it does have the flintiness and little gentle smokiness and those kind of elements, and obviously you're doing the full solids ferment, so those elements are kind of creeping in a subtle way. But where do you sit on that fence and of seeing like the sort of really reductive styles of Chardonnay and
Yeah, it's really interesting, Mike, because firstly, I find it's really interesting, the way people talk about sulfides, because that's what I assume that you're referring to. You're referring when you talk about reductive, but actually, we need to kind of separate reduction, which is where you get your sulfide character with a D, versus reductive winemaking, because reductive winemaking is like the exclusion of oxygen, right? But Chardonnay, you're not excluding oxygen. In fact, it's quite oxidative, especially with that juice phase as well. You want to oxidize the phenolics. So I think, so I'm now obviously being surrounded in the industry, people talk about reductive wines all the time, but I think they should probably be referred to as reduced if you're talking about like sulfide reduction.
they are to a point almost where they are not in the way when it's these wines, when you taste like a sort of a brand new, let's say Sauvignon Blanc would often be like that, not reduced like, oh, that's sort of actively gone to sort of the full on not quite the Captain Cabbage stage, but yeah, the sort of it's where it dominates the characteristic of the wine. And I'm talking in more sort of premium wines which are bottled and ready for sale. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, in that spectrum of sulfides, you have positive sulfides and you have not so positive sulfides, the ones you want to avoid, right? Dirty sulfides. And so I think that sulfides have their place in many wine styles. I think they can be quite an attractive element and a complexing element to wine. I think in Chardonnays in particular, a nice amount of positive sulfide, when it's in balance, can actually bridge between the fruit and the oak really nicely. And I think if you to pluck a high quality example out of the air, that's Costa-Rica, right? And so we personally love that kind of style of that, when that reduction, the positive sulfide, flinty, struck match, popcorn character is there in balance without the dirty sulfides. And so you see plenty of examples of people trying to do that sort of style, but they've got positive sulfides and dirty, negative, fridgy, salami, stale sulfides as well. And so what we found out, and obviously Matt's been doing this a lot longer, and has perfected this art down to a T. It's a big part of that style, and I think if you're looking for something like that, that's where our Reed Vineyard Chardonnay is very much in that style of having some nice flinty struck match popcorn notes, but in balance with the fruit and the oak. Is not stirring the lees is a big part of it, because some people think that, if I stir over the lees, I'll get some of that nice sulfide character out of that. But actually, I think in a lot of ways you either go the whole hog and you stir the crap out of it and get that nutty kind of broad richness of that some people still really like, and I can appreciate those kind of nutty oxidative styles of at least stirred barrels, or you go nothing, because if you go in the middle you get that there's a complex oxidation reduction chemistry that happens with when you're actually oxidizing the lees at the bottom, and they're going from a reductive state into that oxidative state, and that's when you get those the more complex sulfides building, and you don't get that. You have still some of that flinty struck match, that benzyl mercaptan, but you kind of get into the mercaptan cabbagey kind of notes as well. So we've always found not stirring the lees gives you more pure struck match and character, but it also, if you're not filtering, it makes it much easier to filter as well, because you don't have all this shear from the stirring up of the barrels.
If you were then, we're fortunate of never having to sit in that blind tasting room again, but if you were blind tasting this wine against a bunch of other Chardonnays from around the world, what is it for you that identifies it as being from New Zealand and from Marlborough?
For me, New Zealand wines always have this freshness and vibrancy and purity to them, and I think I just, it's becoming increasingly difficult. I pity the MW students that are having to kind of do it in this day and age, where you've got, I guess there's a coming together in a lot of ways of wine styles from New World, Old World. It's incredibly difficult to do, but I think, for me, it's definitely that fruit vibrancy and brightness, and I think that comes from our climate. That high UV sunshine that we get just does something to bring out that varietal distinctiveness that we have. And I think I always say to any wine students, if you're looking to just starting out on your blind tasting journey, use New Zealand as your benchmark, because a Pinot Gris from New Zealand is pears, and it's Pinot Gris to a T. Sauvignon Blanc is so recognizable from Marlborough as Sauvignon Blanc. The same with the Pinots, so I think we've got this really amazing ability with the fruit we get here to really drive home those varietal, typicities and distinctions.
And then that leads us on nicely to, if that's what New Zealand and Marlborough, to Appellation Marlborough, of which you are the chair. So it's there's obviously generic bodies and regional bodies for all sorts of wine regions around the world. But what is Appellation Marlborough, and what is the sort of challenge, or what are you set up to do?
Appellation Marlborough wine was started in 2018 by a small group of quite concerned, quality-focused producers who thought, actually, if we don't take collective action here, we're going to be seeing all that we've built and all the reputation that Marlborough has built over the last sort of 30, 40 years go down the drain, essentially. And I think Appellation Marlborough wine is different to a regional body or a national body, because this is a voluntary organisation. And since 2018, we've had our membership swell to kind of approaching 60 members now, which is a fair chunk of the Marlborough wine industry. We've got 160 wineries. And what it is all about is protecting and safeguarding the reputation of the region through a set of guardrails, essentially. So some quality standards and things that are put in place to ensure that consumers and trade can trust that if it's got that A&W mark on it, it is something that a product that has provenance, authenticity, integrity, and quality. Because I hate saying this, but at the moment I wouldn't necessarily, if it has Marlborough on the label, I wouldn't trust that it's actually going to be a good representation and live up to the quality standards that that the success of the region has been founded on. And I guess that's how all appellations are created in the first place. It's because there's a product that starts doing particularly well and rises to fame, and because of that success, you get other people who come in to try and cash in, or benefit from that, and start cutting some corners, to start taking some shortcuts. And so it's that the original group of people then go, right, well, we need some rules and some standards to ensure that this doesn't that this brand and reputation isn't destroyed. So that's what Appellation Marlborough is all about, Mike. It's a really, we've had for 50 years of Sauvignon Blanc on the ground here now in Marlborough, and I think we've been arguably one of the most successful wine regions in the New World in that short space of time, in terms of that recognition and getting the bottle prices that we have been able to achieve. The average bottle price is particularly high. So yeah, now it's a matter of, we've got a really committed collective group of people who are voluntaries. They pay a second levy essentially to be part of the organisation, and we've got minimum quality standards such as a minimum ripeness level, so that every Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc has to meet that minimum bricks level before it's certified. And that's every batch as well. It's not an average. It's every single batch that comes in the door, and it also has to be from 100% from within the Marlborough defined viticultural region that is on the AMW map. It has to be tasted by an independent panel blind before it's certified on objective sensory criteria, so that it's typical of and living up to the quality standards. And then it also has to be bottled in New Zealand as well, and that ensures provenance and quality. A few reasons for that. I mean, AMW is about the sustainability of the industry and the future of the region as a whole too. So we've had a sobering statistic that now over half of all of New Zealand wine is actually exported in bulk. And if you think about the cultural value of all that manufacturing and bottling, all that value has been handed offshore. It's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But it also is a quality aspect to that too, because it's quite interesting. There's a lot of work been done into bulk shipping, and one of the main reasons touted for bottling offshore is the carbon emissions argument. But it's again, this is a very complex calculation, because a lot of those calculations don't take into account what happens once the wine gets to its bottling destination in Europe or wherever it's going. It's all that post-shipment, post-delivery out to the various markets, which are often lorried and in smaller units across to the various individual markets. So that's a complex argument, but I think it's often used as a matter of convenience, because it's cheaper to do it offshore, right?
In the UK, with obviously being a big market for New Zealand wines, but just the absolute crazy fluctuation of bulk market prices since 2022 to now is it's wild, really. So it's not good for a region, and I think from my point of view, the consumers can handle a little bit of up or down, but I can totally see why you're doing it. With the message can get diluted, and what made Marlborough such a strong force on wine lists and in people's glasses, and people sort of having respect for the name, can start to get diluted. So how can you get the appellation Marlborough into their minds? It's quite a big job to sort of have the marketing work to get people to recognise Appellation Marlborough as a thing. How are you going about doing that?
It is, Mike. Yeah. So for the last few years, admittedly, we've just been trying to get the foundations right, because obviously this is it's all new territory. Trying to get a system that is robust but not overly complicated. Like we've been able to learn from appellations in Europe and what works and what doesn't work. So we've got a really good solid system now, which I think has enough guardrails in place, as well as that tasting process that happens. So now this next phase is about building that brand awareness and really starting that marketing piece. And so that's a big part of our job now and leading into the future is really focusing on communicating that brand message and what AMW means.